I worked for a long time with the big networks, NBC and so forth, overseas for a long time. And when I decided to get married, I came down to Washington and I decided to set up my own news service based in the White House. So I got my Secret Service something called a hard pass, which enables you to walk in and out whenever you want, which is quite valuable. Mr. Trump has not taken it away from us just yet. We're never quite sure. And I distribute television and radio content to stations around the country. I have clients on 4 different continents, USA Today columns and everything. So that's what I do. So enough about that. So this book is sort of a result of the 9 years that I've been working in the White House. I'm actually one of those White House reporters in the briefing room that this new president claims not to like. So you're looking in the flesh at one of these, lying disseminators of fake news. So don't hold that against me. Sometimes they say you guys got, horns coming out of your head, but I was shaving this morning, didn't see any horns just yet. But so this book is really just such that aside, it's really such a wonderful honor to work in the White House, to go in there every day, or just about every day. I'm clearly, obviously not there today, but it's really such an honor and a treat to go in there, and you never lose sight of where you are, the history that surrounds you all the time, and the people who have walked the halls where you are. It's just remarkable, and it was sort of that inspiration that led me to write this. So we're not going to talk about every president. Obviously, there's just not enough time to do that. But so let's just plunge in. One thing that people don't know about the White House is that it's actually much older than you think. When John Adams moved into the White House, it was November the 1st, 1800. What people don't know is that presidents have lived in the White House longer than kings and queens in Buckingham Palace. It's true. Kings and queens did not move into Buckingham Palace until 1837. Tokyo's Imperial Palace in the lower left-hand corner, 1869, and going back to one of my old stomping grounds, Moscow, that's the Kremlin there, did not become the head of, the Soviet government then, the Russian government now, until 1918. They had been, the Tsarist, the Romanov family had been in Russia, in Moscow for centuries, and then they moved to St. Petersburg with Peter the Great. Didn't come back to Moscow till 1918. So the White House really has quite an ancient history that people sometimes forget, more than 200 years now. This, obviously, the only president who never lived there, George Washington, but he was quite instrumental in picking the design for the White House. There was a design competition with about a $500 prize, which was big money back then. One of the entrants was submitted anonymously by a guy named Thomas Jefferson, who was a bit too dabbled in architecture. A little bit, his design was rejected, and the winning design was from an Irishman named James Hoban. And Mr. Washington also picked the location for the White House as well. Only man who never lived there, in fact. Construction of the White House took about 8 years. And you can see in the picture here, I've got the wireless on so I can walk around now, right? Yeah. You can see sort of the broad contours of the building here. This is sort of the balcony on the south lawn today. This would be where Marine One, the helicopter, lands and so forth. And across in the north, on the upper end of the picture, that's obviously what is today Virginia, and this would be Lafayette Park and so forth. Today's West Wing would be right about here. This painting, by the way, is by Peter Waddell for the White House Historical Association, just a wonderful painting. Now, the White House, as I mentioned, 8 years to build it, mostly slave labor, and it cost about $232,000. Now, I did the math on this so you wouldn't have to, and it cost, in today's terms, is about $75 million to build. Now, since we have a real estate guy in the White House, the real estate firm Zillow has appraised the White House, and not that it's on the market or anything, it's not for sale. And they say that, that the land, which is really 18 acres, as you certainly know, 18 acres, and would be appraised at about $393 million. Sounds like a jumbo mortgage to me. And this would be sort of what the ad in the paper might sound like. Prime location, 18 acres, 16 bedrooms, 35 baths. I hear the amenities are pretty good too. You can walk to work also, which is a big, pretty good security most of the time. So it's quite good. Now, I mentioned when Adams moved in, as you can see, there was no north portico, no south portico, and the image on the top, looking sideways, this would be sort of the south lawn here, which at the time was the principal entrance to the White House, and John Adams would roll up in his carriage and he would walk up that little ramp, and that's how he would get into the White House, and the north side of it is in the image below. Now, the story about Adams in the laundry and everything, and Abigail, that's true. Adams did not get to enjoy the White House very long. He was defeated in the election of 1800 by his friend turned rival, Thomas Jefferson, so he moved out only about 5 months later in March. But he left behind something that is still there today, and in fact, it gave me the inspiration for my book. Has anybody here ever, a lot of you toured the White House, I'll bet, right? You go into the state dining room, and you see the famous George Healey portrait of Lincoln. You know the painting I'm talking about. The mantle below that has a carving that John Adams wrote on his first full day in the White House. It was November the 2nd, 1800, and he wrote a letter to Abigail, who was back home in Massachusetts. And in the letter he wrote, excuse me while I look down here, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." I have no idea what you're giggling about, but I might. But that was the inspiration for the book. Now, when Adams wrote that, those words actually kind of disappeared for about 13 decades until Franklin Roosevelt found them after he moved into the White House in 1933. And FDR was so impressed and moved by those words that he ordered them carved into that mantle. And that's an actual picture of the mantle there. So it kind of vanished into the sort of the dusty archives of White House history for more than a century until FDR found them, and that is where they are today. So if you ever take the White House tour, and they resume, I think, March 7th, they just announced yesterday, they've been kind of stopped them for a little while. You can see that. So that was John Adams. Now, when Jefferson moved in, Jefferson, as I mentioned, obviously an architect and a Renaissance man, all kinds of things. He could not resist the temptation to kind of tinker around with the building and do some things. And the famous east and west colonnades that you see, sometimes you see the president, you've seen this on TV a million times, president kind of walking down the sort of that covered walkway that goes to the Oval. That was Jefferson's inspiration. There's one on the west side, there's one on the east side. Jefferson also was unhappy with something that that John Adams had. There were no working toilets in the White House when Adams was president, and Thomas Jefferson was a little more fastidious than that, so he decided that he was going to install some rain catchers on the roof of the White House, and he ran pipes down into, and he called them water closets back then, I guess using the British terms. So the White House had its first toilets thanks to Thomas Jefferson. John Adams, believe it or not, the President of the United States, had to sort of run out into an outhouse and take care of his business, and Jefferson thought that was not a particularly dignified thing to do. So good for Mr. Jefferson. Jefferson also made an additional change. He changed the principal entrance to the White House to the north side. This picture is about a century old. I don't remember the exact date, but aside from the door itself, the surroundings look pretty much as they do today, sort of the half moon window and the very intricately carved stone carvings above that. I mentioned the slave labor. Those stone carvings were actually done by these very talented Scottish stonemasons. Being of Scottish descent, I waste no chance to tout my native Scotland, but that's what they did. And you can see that today too when you come out of the White House after the end of the tour. You come out that door on the north side, so you can turn around when you're done taking your selfie, and you can look at those carvings. They're just gorgeous, and they're still there today. Now Jefferson, and here's the state dining room, as I mentioned, and there's the mantle with Mr. Adams' words. This is a modern floor plan of the state floor. This is how it is. What's interesting, though, is that when Jefferson was president, what says state dining room today was actually Thomas Jefferson's office. That's where he worked. And this is what it looked like. This is another painting by Peter Waddell for White House Historical Association. And what you can see, I'm going to come over here and show you, is that Jefferson, here he is, he's surrounded with all his books and his maps, and he had gardening tools in his desk. Come on your way here. All of his things here. And see in the upper right-hand corner next to the painting there, can you see that? That was his pet mockingbird. Jefferson had a pet bird, and it flew around the White House, and its name was Dick. And Jefferson actually trained the bird to, it would land on his shoulder, and he would feed the bird from his own lips. That's what the president did. The other remarkable thing, and this is why Peter Waddell put this other figure in this painting. Anybody know who this other person is in the painting? It's a guy named Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark. There's a pop quiz later, of Lewis and Clark fame. And Jefferson, of course, who was from Albemarle County area of Virginia, sort of down near Monticello. So was the Lewis family, and Jefferson was a widower. Of course, Martha had died, I think, in 1782. And so he wrote a letter to Lewis. He had the family connection and everything. And he said, well, how would you like to come and work in the White House with me? I need an assistant. I just need a guy to work with. So Lewis did, and I mentioned that in the state dining room where Jefferson's office was, Lewis actually lived in the East Room. That's the south side of the East Room, biggest room in the White House. And what they did was they took some sort of canvas, I guess sort of material for sort of sailcloth from a sailing ship, and they partitioned two rooms for Meriwether Lewis. One was his bedroom, and the other was just sort of his office, where they worked. So, and very often it was just the two of them all day long. They'd go back and forth down the great Cross Hall plotting and scheming, and the one thing that that Jefferson was really intrigued about from the beginning was the Louisiana Purchase, and he was already dreaming about what it could mean for the country. It would expand the country's defensive perimeter and just all kinds of advantages, but it wasn't for sale until early in his administration when quite a bit of serendipity, it became available. Napoleon needed to raise some money for his war with the British and so forth. So they put the deal together, and off Lewis went to team up with Clark, and off they went. So that is sort of the story of Jefferson. Now, I'm going to talk for a second about Dolly Madison, who I think one of the greatest first ladies ever. And when Dolly Madison was first lady, everybody wanted to meet Dolly. She was gorgeous, and she was vivacious, absolutely charming. She could throw just terrific parties. This room is today the Blue Room. You can tell by the oval shape. In her era, she had a different color preference. Apparently, it was red, but her parties were all the rage, and then, as now, getting an invitation to a White House party was a really big deal. Everybody wanted to go to a party at the White House, and not so much to meet the president. James Madison always wore black and was kind of dour. He was sort of described as sort of a feudal mortician, and just kind of he was all business, and he was not the most. In today's television age, he would not be a very good politician because he just didn't have the sort of the charm that you have to have today to reach out to people. But Dolly did, and she compensated for that. So her parties were just all the rage. The food was great. The liquor was top shelf, and she served a dessert that became sort of all the rage that today is known as ice cream. That was one of her, not quite sure what the connection is with the snack cakes later on, but anybody knows, I'll put that in my next book. Of course, the best thing that Dolly Madison is probably remembered for, though, is helping to save the portrait of George Washington when the British came to town in August 1814. When you tour the White House and you're in the East Room, then as now, this famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington, it's a huge painting. It's about 8 feet by 5 feet, and it hangs there today. She refused to go. The president was off at the front, so they sort of missed each other that day. And it was time for her to go. She said, "I'm not leaving until we're saving that painting. I am not going." The problem was that you couldn't just take the frame down off the wall. The frame was actually bolted to the wall. So one of the assistants in the White House, it was actually a slave named Paul Jennings, and another guy, they literally had to take a hatchet and they just hacked it out of the frame, lay it on the ground, and it was only then that she left. So she did not leave with the painting. She left after she knew it had been taken down, and some businessmen took it away a little bit later. So she was there for that. So that's a pretty accurate painting there on the bottom. So we're going to skip ahead just a little bit to Andrew Jackson. And again, the stories that are in this book, I wanted to find stories that make people say, "Gosh, I didn't know that," or things that kind of surprise you a little bit. That's sort of what the stories are about. So the only story I'm going to tell you then about Andrew Jackson is, and this is the picture that was taken several years after he left the presidency, about a month before he died, in fact, in 1845. And he looked quite feeble, and he was not in the best of health even as a president. He survived several duels, was in lifelong pain because of that. Really a tough guy. But what people don't know is that on his own inauguration day, it was March the 4th, that's when presidents used to get inaugurated. It was March the 4th, 1829, and if you notice that President Trump has hung a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office. So there are a lot of comparisons between Trump and Jackson that President Trump seems to enjoy. They both fancy themselves as, kind of outsiders, coming to Washington and crashing the system and trying to, turn the culture upside down. Jackson actually did that to a certain degree, and I think that has resonated with Trump. It's a very different era, though, so I'm not making any predictions, but Trump sees a lot of Jackson in himself, at least in that one regard. But anyway, on his inauguration day, so all these people from around the country, kind of the populists who really loved Jackson, came to the White House. Wasn't much in the way of security, and there was a huge open party that day. Just booze and food was everywhere. And what happens when you get a bunch of wild revelers and a bunch of alcohol in the same room? Well, trouble ensues, and it became a real melee. And at one point, Jackson, who was 61 then, found himself kind of pinned against the wall by this. There were well-wishers, but it was just such a big crowd, and he could not breathe. And his aides had to take him out a window there to safety, and that's how the president survived. But the White House itself, this was only 15 years after the British destroyed the White House. These American partiers, they destroyed it from the inside almost. With the rugs were muddied and the furniture broken and china smashed and everything. It was a real god-awful mess. And they didn't really do that anymore after that. So that's sort of the Jackson story that people don't know, is that he was nearly killed on his own inauguration day. Quite interesting. Now again, I'm not telling stories on every president here. We'd be here for a couple of days here. We hear a lot today about presidents who are criticized for, maybe some people think they play too much golf, or they spend too much time on the ranch, or whatever it is. President Trump tomorrow is going to Florida for the third weekend in a row, and already people are, carping about that. It's different people carping about the same issues. It was Republicans carping about Obama playing golf, and now the Democrats are saying he's going to Florida again, but it's the same stuff. Nobody would have complained about James Polk because he rarely took any days off in his entire four-year term. Probably the most consequential one-term president ever. He came into office with 4 very strictly defined goals. He nailed every one of them and then retired, as he said he would. But he literally took only a handful of days off, and this is probably not a good lesson in sort of a governing and management standpoint for a modern-day White House, but Polk managed everything to a ridiculously granular degree. Schedules, he wrote all his own letters, did all his own legislative correspondence, and even back then it was an enormous amount of work. He did all of it. He had cabinet officials, but he managed them, and he managed the 3 or 4 layers of people beneath each of them as well. And it was just unbelievable. He worked his fingers to the bone, so much, in fact, that he dropped dead 3 months after leaving the White House. So that was James Polk. The other interesting thing about Polk is that in the middle of his term, the first known photograph of the White House was taken. It was in 1846. No West Wing here. The West Wing would not be built until Theodore Roosevelt in 1901. And as you can see, this is the South Lawn, obviously. That's the windows where Jackson was hustled to safety. No Truman balcony here. And this is kind of a Grant's tomb kind of question here, but when do you think the Truman balcony was? Anybody? It wasn't for quite a while until about a century later. But even a beautiful building even then, and since, as I mentioned, there was no west wing, the president's office was on the second floor, down on the right side, and the presidential bedroom was, I wish I had that laser pointer, was right here. This is where the president slept. So that's the first picture of the White House. Now we're going to jump ahead to this man needs no introduction here, but this photograph of Lincoln was taken by Alexander Gardner, and I believe the date was February the 4th or 5th, February the 4th, I think, 1865, which would date it about 9 weeks before his assassination. You've seen this photo before of him, no doubt. But what's interesting is that it has since been colorized. So we now get to see Mr. Lincoln in the flesh. And it's the only reason I'm showing it to you is just because we don't get to see this photo of Lincoln very often. And it is a remarkable photo. And Lincoln suffered from melancholy, which today, of course, we would call depression. He had severe issues with that, and with good reason. The Civil War, obviously, was just a god-awful burden on him. One of his three sons, Willie, died in the White House, February 20th, 1862. It was a unending stress and burden for him. And I think you can see that, or at least I can pretend to see it in his eyes. Look in his eyes here. I think that's just the deep pockets of sadness, where he seems sort of lost. You can interpret. People see different things in photos, I suppose, but that's what I see. He just looks sort of like a very tired and weary man, and you can compare that to pictures taken of him in 1860 or so, the year when he was elected. And they say the presidency ages men, and it certainly did with Lincoln, no question about it. Lincoln spent a ton of hours in the telegraph room. Now, did you see that Spielberg film, Lincoln, a couple years ago? Really very accurate, detailed film. Spielberg did a really good job working with Doris Kearns Goodwin, just highly detailed and accurate. And Lincoln, there's a couple of scenes in there where Lincoln is sort of the telegraph room waiting for these dispatches from his commanders in the field. The story here is that that room was not in the White House. It was in what is next door and what is today the Eisenhower Executive Office building here. That's sort of that ugly Gothic building next to the White House. That's where it was. But what's interesting about the telegraph is that it really was one of the first uses of military technology that helped Lincoln manage the war in a really effective way. He was so impressed with the telegraph. In fact, he got, just after he was inaugurated in 1861, he got the first coast-to-coast telegraph sent from California. It was sent by the Chief Justice of the state of California. And the speed with which he got that information so impressed Lincoln that he ordered the federal government to eliminate its contract with the Pony Express, which prior to then was how the federal government got, newspapers and stuff back and forth to the West Coast. It was the Pony Express, which took several days. Lincoln, the Pony Express went out of business real fast after it lost its federal contract, and you can thank job killer Abe Lincoln for that, I suppose. But all out with a slow and in with the fast, and so that's what they did. So that was really one of the first uses of technology being used by presidents in a national security situation. Plenty more examples like that, but I think that perhaps is the most interesting one. Now, the Elaine was telling you, I thought you were going to give the story away, but in the intro, talking about how did Lincoln actually sleep in the Lincoln bedroom? And the answer is sort of yes and no. It's not quite where you thought. Now, this is a modern floor plan of the second floor of the White House, and I'm thinking nobody here has ever been on that second floor. The only way you get on the second floor is you got to get yourself elected president, or which apparently anybody can do, or not sure how that slipped out, or you can get an invitation. I'm not referring to anybody, by the way. Or you can get an invitation. But that is there now, and it's a gorgeous room. The problem is, though, that that was not a bedroom in Lincoln's day. In Lincoln's era, it was actually his office, and it was called the shop. And as you can see, this is yet another painting by Peter Waddell. It's just spectacular. You can see over here, here are his maps. He managed the Civil War. He had these maps which sort of show the disposition of the Union and the Confederate forces. And here's his battered furniture. And I'll try not to get in your way. You can see these tubes coming down here. They had lighting. It was gas lighting back then, but the lighting, like this lamp on the table, the gas would come down from these rubber tubes, and that's how the lamps would be lit. So there are rubber tubes hanging all over the place in the White House, and that's how they did it. But that was progress, because prior to then they were lit by whale oil and all kinds of things which just stunk up the house and everything. What's also interesting about this photo is that sometimes the Confederate Army was so close that Lincoln could look out the window across the river to, that is looking out over the South Lawn. He could look out across the river to Virginia, and he could see sometimes Confederate campfires at night twinkling in the distance, or their flags flying on their camps. So the enemy was quite close during the war from time to time. And see this is hard to see here, but can you guys see that right there? That's the Washington Monument. And have you ever noticed how the Washington Monument is actually two colors? You ever notice that? The reason for that is that during the Civil War, the federal government built about a third of it, and then they ran out of money, and they had to stop. Imagine that. The federal government actually ran out of money. They had to spend it on the war. So they stopped. So that's all that Lincoln ever saw, and they finished that later on after he left. So that was his office. He called it the shop. That's where he met with his cabinet. That's where he issued his Emancipation Proclamation, which is really just one of these executive orders that you hear about. Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. This is that room today. See the curtains and everything? This kind of looks the same, right? So this is actually a 2007 picture. Laura Bush did a really nice renovation about a decade ago, and that is what it looked like. Now there's the famous rosewood bed. Now, Mary Lincoln bought that furniture, by the way, so the furniture is indeed authentic, but there's no evidence that Lincoln actually slept in what is called the Lincoln bed. There's no evidence to really show that. So the question is then, if Lincoln did not sleep in the Lincoln bedroom, well, where did he sleep? And the answer is, well, in the true Lincoln bedroom, which, if you remember the picture of the White House from before, he slept in the president's bedroom, which is down on the southwest corner of the White House, and there's his office, which today is called the Lincoln bedroom. Now, the Lincoln bedroom, as we know it today, was only built by the Trumans as a tribute to Mr. Lincoln. So the Lincoln bedroom has only been around for about 75 years or so. So that is where Lincoln slept, and that is a floor plan of Lincoln's era, in fact. the crush of visitors was such, and there were security concerns as well, that they actually had to build this secret passageway for him to get from his sleeping quarters through a library, sort of their living room, to his office. So for the entire Lincoln presidency, this was the only private area, really, that they had. It was quite remarkable. I mean, today, of course, they have the entire second floor, and there's a third floor that Calvin Coolidge added on top of that. But in Lincoln's era, that's all they had was just those few rooms. So it was quite claustrophobic. So as I mentioned, the White House, there are plenty of, this is obviously a modern picture, there are plenty of rooms that have changed purpose and design over the centuries, so not everything is how it was originally designed or anything like that. And if you see, I'll tell you one more story about one room in the mansion itself. In the old days, well, let me go back to this one for a second. You can't quite see it, but on the ground floor, hidden behind this tree, this room here, in the old days, was a presidential dining room, and today it's called the Old Family Dining Room because, and there it is, that's the ground floor. So when you take the tour, that's what you see. So that was, well, it still is in fact a dining room, but it's not really used all that often, and I'll tell you why in a second. Sometimes when I go into the White House early in the morning, here's a picture I took of a new dining room on the second floor, and so if you see the light on there, that means that the president or a member of the first family is in there getting a cup of coffee or something, and they pay for their own groceries, by the way. Sometimes you see a shadowy figure in there that sort of looked like President Obama, but you never really know. So sometimes you would in fact see kind of a person in that window, and that's where it is, and that's the window on the second floor. So the president today, President Trump and President Obama before him, they can just walk across the hall, and that's where they can eat. And that's the room there, as I mentioned, second one from the right. But as I mentioned, that room only became a dining room because of Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy, when they moved into the White House, she was very protective of Caroline and John Jr., and she did not want to have to take her kids downstairs to that other dining room all the time to eat. She thought that was too burdensome. She wanted more privacy for her kids. So she said, we don't need all these bedrooms up here. Let's convert one of them into this dining room, and she did. And this is what it looked like, sort of designed in sort of the classic Jackie way, and that is what that's what it looked like. Here, in fact, is President Ford, your uncle, having orange juice. I think this is 1975. Look at that cool TV on the. Remember those? He would read his morning papers and briefing books and whatnot. So there he is. And here is Nancy Reagan with Mrs. Obama. This, I believe, was Nancy Reagan's final. She just passed about 11 months ago, as you recall. That, I believe, was her final visit to the White House. The Obamas invited her to come and visit, and they had a very nice chat. So that's where that picture was taken as well. So I've always wondered that as all of these families from the Kennedys up to the present eat in that room, have their coffee and their family dinners and such, I wonder if they are aware of the true history of that room, which is actually quite a morbid history. In that dining room, one president, William Henry Harrison, died in that room. He was the first president to actually die in the White House. Well, the only one, in fact. Willie Lincoln, as I mentioned, died in that room in 1862. And after President Lincoln himself was assassinated in 1865, his body was taken from Peterson House, across from Ford's Theater, of course, back to the White House, where it was autopsied and embalmed in what is today the dining room. So, by the way, that's a National Geographic reproduction, a picture of the actual thing. So it's quite a morbid history, and I think one of the kind of lesser known examples of how these rooms have changed purpose and tone over the years. Since we're talking about the Kennedys, I always try and I always get more questions about Lincolns and Kennedys more than anybody else. So the story about the Kennedys is that obviously everybody knows that when Jacqueline Kennedy came in, the White House was actually was a bit, well, in her words, she's a bit patrician. It was a bit dowdy in her words, maybe Eisenhower and Bess Truman and Eleanor Roosevelt before that. And she wanted to kind of spruce things up a little bit. So as you know, she went on this massive effort to, in her words, restore the White House to its original roots. So she teamed up with antique experts and historians and whatnot. And she found all kinds of authentic pieces of furniture and artwork and china and this and that, brought it all back to the White House and really restored its luster in a really remarkable way. There might be a few of you in the room, might have been obviously much younger, you might have remembered her, that famous CBS special that she did where she took viewers. It was a huge TV special. So she got a lot of credit for that. But what people don't know, by the way, just as a quick aside, she got a lot of credit for that. But one first lady who probably did even more than her, who did not get any credit for her efforts, was actually Pat Nixon, who came two first ladies later. Pat Nixon actually might have done even more than Mrs. Kennedy. Never sought or received credit for it. She did too many things to mention here, but when you sort of look at the way the White House looks today, it's lit up at night because of her. The flag flies 24/7 over the White House because of her, on and on and on. Pat Nixon was really just responsible for a lot of that. So when I talk about things that the Kennedys did, I always like to mention Pat Nixon, who I thought was a really terrific and frankly unheralded first lady. But anyway, that's what Jacqueline Kennedy did. But John F. Kennedy himself also made a big change to the White House, and it stemmed from one of his foreign policy failures, the Bay of Pigs, which happened 3 months after he was inaugurated in April '61. Now, you know the history of that, but the result of it was that Kennedy was unhappy with the quality and the speed of the data and the analysis that he was getting from say, the CIA and the Pentagon and so forth. He wanted just raw data coming to him directly in the White House, unfiltered, unanalyzed by bureaucrats. So he decided that he wanted what was called a situation room. So they took out what was then a bowling alley that had been given to Harry Truman, who never really bowled, he played poker. And they took out the bowling alley and put in JFK's situation room that began operations roughly on about May 1st, 1961. And this is one of the early pictures of the situation room. Kind of looks like sort of a 1960s like rec room, suburban rec room or something, doesn't it? No big deal. But it came into rather prominent use just a year and a half later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Kennedy was right in that it enabled him to get faster, unvarnished information that he and his close circle of aides could examine on their own, and that helped. There are a lot of things. The Cuban Missile Crisis is another discussion, but the Situation Room and the fact that it existed was certainly a very big help. Now here's a modern floor plan of the West Wing itself. You can see sort of the oval in the middle of the room that's sort of on the floor above that. That's where the Oval Office is. My office is in the cheap seats here where it says swimming pool above that. That's where I am. That's where the briefing room is. It could be a pool again. Well, by the way, hang on. I want to be fair here and say that people think that, oh, Trump is going to take the briefing room back and kick us out. Well, first of all, that's government property. It doesn't belong to us, and he can do whatever he wants. But people also forget that Hillary Clinton, as First Lady, also tried to rebuild the swimming pool too. She wanted an indoor pool when the Clintons were in the White House, and there was serious talk about that. So we were wondering last fall when it looked like Clinton was going to win, is she going to take the pool back? Because she tried to about 20 years ago. But it belongs to the taxpayers, and the president can do with it what he pleases. The only reason we're there in the first place is because Richard Nixon built that briefing room for us in 1970. It has not been around for very long. So that sidebar aside, the Situation Room, people think it's just one room. It's actually a couple of rooms, as you can see. It's about 5,000 square feet or so. And I suppose the most famous picture that most folks have ever seen of the Situation Room was, and you know the picture I'm talking about, the night of the bin Laden raid, when President Obama and Clinton, and the whole government, Biden, they were all in there, and that's where it was taken, in one of the video conference rooms. So that is the Situation Room. Now, there's one room that Jacqueline Kennedy, this is the second to last story we're going to tell here. There's one room in the White House complex that Jacqueline Kennedy did not get around to changing. Well, she did. The timing of it is rather curious. The Oval Office had sort of the greenish carpeting and drapery that really dated back to the Truman era. And after she had done the mansion itself, the incredible restoration job that she did, she said to President Kennedy, well, I want to redo your Oval Office too. He said, fine. And by the way, that's Caroline and one of her cousins, the famous door in the Resolute desk, playing around. He was also the first president to actually put that desk in the Oval, by the way, even though it had been gifted to the White House nearly a century before. It didn't president actually used it. Well, the Oval Office only dates to 1909, but Kennedy was the first person to actually use it then. So anyway, he said, yes, go ahead and redecorate the office. The workmen told President and Mrs. Kennedy, we need about 2 days to do the job, to move all the furniture out and take out the carpeting and the drapes and so forth. So let us know when you're going to be, both of you are going to be away for 2 days. Well, as it turns out, this was the fall of 1963, and the only 2-day period that they were both going to be away was the third weekend of November 1963. So the Kennedys, of course, that trip to Texas, they started in San Antonio, and they went to Houston, and then Fort Worth. And on Friday, the 22nd of November, they flew from Fort Worth to Dallas, quick, I think 13-minute plane flight. And literally that very day, as they get into the motorcade in Dallas, and we know what happened next. It was right about then that the workmen were, they had taken all the furniture and the carpets out. So right about the same time that the president was assassinated, they actually put in the brand new carpet right about the same time the president was being murdered. The color of that carpet on the day of his murder was a deep blood red. This is actually what it looked like the day of the assassination. They took photographs of it the day after. Same resolute desk and everything, new drapes and such. Jacqueline Kennedy, she picked out the color scheme and everything. And when they came back to the White House early the next morning, about 4:30 in the morning on the 23rd, she slept for about 2 hours that morning, and at one point asked to be escorted down to the Oval where she could see it, and she looked at it for a minute or two and she left. And Jacqueline Kennedy actually only returned to the White House once over the course of her entire life after she moved. She moved out 2 weeks later, came back just once for a private dinner with the President and Mrs. Nixon. And that was it. It was just too painful for her to come back. But she and the Nixons got along quite well, particularly after that, and it was a very lovely dinner. So kind of an eerie story, I think. And again, it's one of these are the sort of the stories that I was looking for, things that's like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that when I was researching the book. It was just a remarkable story. So there are just too many stories to tell here. I mean, we've just barely touched just 5 or 6 presidents here. You know, the Roosevelts, and there's probably the Nixons on their happiest day, the I think June 13th, 1971 wedding of Tricia. There's a picture of, I took that picture myself, that's the Obamas in February 2010 when they came back from the Christmas vacation in Hawaii. Look how young the girls look in that picture. I think Malia is having her gap year now. She's off to Harvard, I think, in the fall, and Sasha has one more year in high school. But so that's a good picture. But boy, there are 100 other stories that I could tell you, but I'll tell you just one more. And there's a pop quiz attached to it, by the way. I mentioned before how presidents sometimes are criticized for allegedly taking too much time off, the golf or the ranch or whatever. A lot of presidents have downtime in ways that we don't even know about. They go down to the movie theater and watch a movie. We're not aware of that. It's none of our business. President and Mrs. Reagan watched a lot of movies. Jimmy Carter actually watched way more than anybody. People don't know that. Sometimes President Obama would often hold a Super Bowl party. This one looks like, I think this was his first year, 20. So he'd been in office for, I guess, about 2 weeks when that was taken. But here's a question about the movie theater. You know, we learn a lot about the presidents from the books they read and the movies they watch. It's very revealing, and we learn an awful lot about them. So here's one question. Of all the movies that presidents have seen, and some of these lists have been made public. Gerald Ford was not a movie guy, did not watch movies. But most other presidents did, and they enjoyed them. So the question is, there's one movie, above all, one movie that most presidents say resonated with them more than any other movie. Can anybody guess what that might be? Patton? No. That people always guess Patton, but no. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is a good guess, but that's not it either. What? My Fair Lady? No, I don't. Godfather's a. Well, that was actually Obama's favorite movie. He loved the Godfather. No, I think actually somebody. Gone with the Wind. It's not Gone with the Wind. No, the one movie, and when I explain sort of the story behind it, you'll go, oh, that does make sense. No, the one movie that has resonated with more presidents than any other, by far, High Noon, with Gary Cooper. I'm so glad I used to offer $50 for people who got it. So I'm so glad I didn't offer that cash tonight. I'd be out the $50. Terrible. No, but High Noon, which is really just a wonderful film, Gary Cooper, Grace Kelly. And if you know the plot of that film, the bad guys are coming to town. It's the sheriff. The sheriff's all by himself. The sheriff he's got to defend the town. He's got to keep everybody safe. All his friends have abandoned him. It's just him. So the lonely burden of keeping everybody safe is completely up to him, and by God, he does it. And Grace Kelly wasn't too happy. But the sheriff did what he had to do. And it's sort of that theme, if you will, that really has resonated with a lot of presidents. And that's why, in fact, most presidents, we can't relate to the stress and the responsibility of the job and having a responsibility like that. And that, in fact, is why the presidency is usually called the loneliest job. Nobody can relate to what the job is really like. There are only a handful of people in the world who can really do that. Again, a ton of other stories I can tell you. At this point, I'll just stop and just want to say thank you. Thank you to each of you for coming tonight. It's just such a great honor to speak. This is, I think, my 4th presidential library, so 4 out of 12, I think. And it's just a terrific honor for me to be here, so thank you very much, and I really appreciate all of you coming tonight, so thank you very much. Oh, sure. And I think any questions or? Is there a mic? Oh, there's a microphone in back, I think, yeah.
Thank you for your talk tonight. The question I have is more about the actual architectural history. For example, I believe that the White House was gutted and rebuilt during the Truman administration.
Right.
And I'd like to learn about that, and also what happened after the British burned it during the War of 1812.
Well, the British came in and they torched it from the inside out, and really all that, there have been kind of drawings of what it looked like, and it was pretty much a shell, but it was good enough to rebuild on, or so it was thought, but there were always architectural issues to some degree. After that, during the Lincoln era, for example, the floors sagged, and there were always concerns about that. Things really didn't get bad, though, until I mentioned Calvin Coolidge added a 3rd floor to the White House in the 1920s on top of the old frame. The problem was that the 3rd floor that Coolidge added on had a steel frame, and the weight of the steel frame in the 1920s nearly caused it to collapse in the 1940s when Truman was there. So after Truman was elected in 1948, not re-elected, he was only elected once, in 1948, they came to Truman and said, Mr. President, you've got to move out. We're going to have to tear the White House down. He and Bess and Margaret, their daughter, moved down the street to Blair House. For 4.5 years, they did a complete gut job. You've seen the pictures of it. They literally stripped it to its bones, big excavators taking out just huge mountains of dirt. They went way below ground. There are floors of the White House way below ground, a bomb shelter and such that a lot of it we don't know about. But that's what they did. It was a huge 4.5-year job. There's a good book by that on that particular subject, I think, by the author Robert Clara, which is it's a really incredible story. Yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Thanks for your talk. What kind of security measures are built into the White House just to keep the occupants safe that aren't obvious from the outside?
Well, the The one thing you mentioned was stuff that you don't see. There's sort of layer upon layer, and it actually starts quite some distance from the White House itself. There are sort of officers in civilian clothes, sometimes walking around. You see officers sometimes on bicycles riding around who are uniformed. There are obviously cameras everywhere, and that's even before you get approach the complex itself. There's the fence, which is one issue. They've been trying to raise that for years. I don't know if they'll ever get around to doing it, but you see all of that. What you don't see is, there are infrared motion detectors, things like that on the roof of the White House. You don't see this. And they don't particularly acknowledge it, but there are things like chemical and bio weapons, sensors always sniffing the air, and there are precautions with the water system and things like that. So they're just sort of layer upon layer upon layer. But as you say, a lot of that is unseen, and there are certain ways, if they had to evacuate a president, sort of the goal is to get him out within 60 seconds. They've never really had to do that, but they could. I think the best example of a quick evacuation was on September 11th when President Bush was in Florida that morning, but Vice President Cheney was in his office, and he tells the story of how Secret Service guys literally burst into his office, and they grabbed him by his belt loops. His feet weren't even touching the ground. They picked him up, it's a true story, and they ran him out, and they brought him down into what's called the elevator down to what's called the PEOC, the PEOC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, deep below ground. It's essentially a deep underground bomb shelter, and you've seen probably pictures of Cheney that day down there. They got him out of there in about 45 seconds, so that's what they did. But a lot of that just never seen. Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't recommend jumping the fence, by the way. It's not a good thing to do. Yeah.
I'm just curious, did Ronald Reagan watch his own movies in the theater?
The Reagan Library, there's actually a list of all the films that the Reagans saw, and I think they watched a few of them. Their tastes were very eclectic. They watched everything. They watched most of the movies at camp. They went to Camp David most weekends and watched. They often watched sometimes 3-4 movies a weekend up there. But if you look at the list, they watched a lot of Alfred Hitchcock films. They watched a lot of Westerns. Here's another. Nancy and Ronald Reagan only made one film together that they watched once. It was Hellcats of the Navy in 1957, I think. And the records show that they did watch that one movie together once. They probably laughed. But they did watch a few of their movies, but I think in general they preferred to watch other movies. Yeah. Good question.
In the 1970s, CBS came out with a special called The Back Stairs of the White House, which was an African-American maid who had her whole lifespan and her daughter's lifespan of the whole White House and several different presidents. Secondly, the TV show, The West Wing. If you've seen them, is those portrayals of the White House accurate at all? I mean, that's one look I've seen into the White House that's interesting.
Well, the White House, the first one, I'm familiar with, but haven't seen it. But there's a more current story along the same theme called The Butler, which I think you've seen, which is true. There are White House employees that often span generations, and they go from there. They don't work for the president. They work for the U.S. government, and they're there sometimes for many presidents, 30, 40 years or more. The show, The West Wing, I've seen a couple episodes of that, but it's sort of like bringing your job home with you, so I don't really watch it. I'm familiar. I've seen a few episodes of it, and I think it's pretty accurate. I think the furnishings and the layout and everything seem pretty accurate to me. yeah. As do the dysfunctional characters, yeah. Quite good.
When people give the cost of the original White House, do they include in that the value of the unpaid slave labor? Has anybody ever figured out what that is worth if they were paid the prevailing wages for white people? Just curious.
You've stumped me on that. I don't know. That's a good, interesting question. So your question is, did they figure out the wages of the slaves who built does that factor into the construction cost? Gosh, I don't know. Yeah, boy, I don't, that's an interesting question. I'm sorry, I don't know. Hi.
Hi, good evening. I was wondering if you could speak to the history and design of the Oval Office and the selection of the shape in particular.
The West Wing itself was only built in 1901 because after the McKinley assassination, Theodore and Edith Roosevelt had a very big family, and they were running out of room. So he decided to build the West Wing, and the president's office was there, but in Teddy Roosevelt's West Wing, the Oval Office was just a rectangular room. It was just a regular office. It did not become oval-shaped until his successor, William Howard Taft, in 1909, changed the shape of it, and that's how it became oval. But it didn't become its current location in the southeast corner of the West Wing until Franklin Roosevelt became president because, as I mentioned, the Jefferson Colonnade, FDR needed easier access with his wheelchair. So the West Wing itself, 1901, square office, rectangular office with Teddy Roosevelt. Taft made it to oval. FDR moved it to where it is today. That's sort of the quick history of the oval. Does that answer your question?
And why the shape?
Well, it's oval because in the original White House design, if you saw sort of the Dolly Madison room that I showed you, that's oval, and the yellow oval room on the second floor, it's kind of it matches kind of the original design of the mansion itself. So, yeah.
During the War of 1812, the 1814 burning Washington, it was, I know that it was burned, and it was it a salmon color before it was burned? And is there still remnants of the burn marks of the war, of the?
The first question was it the same, what was the color of the?
It was salmon, it was like a pink, it was no, I'm a Canadian, so it was like, we called it the pink house. And was it a salmon pink color?
It was called the White House for quite a long time, and for the longest period, the White House is actually the largest building in the United States up until about the Civil War, and it was called the White House because it was painted. There have been stories about kind of the salmonish color. As to after the fire, yes, there were burn marks that existed for a long time. In 1991, I think the first President Bush, there was a major renovation job, and they peeled away a whole bunch of layers of paint, and they found scorch marks underneath. I'm not sure how many layers of paint, more than 180 or something years later. So yeah, the burn marks did in fact live on.
And is it visible to see?
No, not now. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is, I was amazed at how Dolly Madison's first name was spelled on the screen. I thought it was D-O-L-L-I-E. And secondly, I'm curious as to how much it costs to upkeep the White House, either on a daily basis or yearly.
Well, you're paying for it. You should know. The upkeep is rather enormous on a $393 million house valuation. There are 90 permanent employees, not employees of the president, but 90 people on the government payroll, and butlers and people who mow the lawn and those kind of things. So 90 employees with all of their government benefits and such. So I think that's probably a good place to start. Security costs, which are classified, so we don't know. You can probably break it down by, you can probably guess based on what it costs to heat and cool rooms in a smaller house, and then perhaps extrapolate those figures to a house the size of the White House, and you can probably do some estimates, but that's probably about as far as you're going to get. But a large part of it, and the security costs there, that we don't know. They're not going to tell us. Interesting question.
When you mentioned the rebuilding of the White House in the Harry Truman days where he had to move out, do you have any idea of what % of the White House is the original? I guess all the rebuilding was union labor, but how much, what's the percentage of the White House now that was original from pre-Harry Truman?
Well, one of the, that was a real big deal because it took 4.5 years. And Truman was kind of stickler for punctuality. He wanted the job finished. And in the Robert Clara book that I mentioned, it's a really good story. He talks about how just to cut corners and get things done fast, there was a lot of original stuff, original door frames and doorknobs and just interesting little tidbits of the original house. All went into some obscure landfill in Virginia. I mean, just truckloads of it. Really a travesty, but Truman just said, get this job done. They didn't want to take the time to kind of, archive a lot of, can you imagine just doing that? That's what they did. So there were a lot of unhappy people about that, but they rebuilt it. And when Truman walked in late 52. It was gorgeous. It was shimmering and just charming and quite authentic. But there were a lot of older pieces that were they just tossed them. It was a bit of a scandal. Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but it was, yeah. So there was a lot of original stuff that was tossed. Yeah. But read the Robert K-L-A-R-A. It's a really good book on that topic. Yeah.
This may sound mundane as we talk about these millions and billions of dollars. What is the capacity of the kitchen? How big can dinners and steak dinners can they throw? And how many people?
Well, these state dinners are usually not so grand in terms of numbers, maybe about 100 people or so, but there are multiple kitchens in the White House. The first family has their own kitchen, as I mentioned, on the second floor. They pay for their own groceries for personal use. By the way, if it's food for an official function like a state dinner, well, you and I pay, but they can have dinners for. I think President Nixon held a dinner for returning Vietnam POWs in 1973. I think there were 1,200 guests. They hold congressional barbecues every year for all members of Congress. So that's 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate, plus all their family members. So they can have big events. So those are usually just cookouts and such, but they can host well over 1,000 people if they have to. State dinners, though, are usually much smaller, 100 people, give or take, I think. Yeah, interesting.
I don't
Make
really
it-
have
make it
a
a good one.
sense of the privacy that's available to the first family. Like, can you walk around in your jammies, or does it feel like you're in a hotel where you just have your bedroom space, and then if you exit, you have to be dressed and ready to present yourself?
Well, there was a big ruckus 2 weeks ago when it was, you might have remembered this story from 2 weeks ago, it was leaked. This Trump White House is there's a lot of leaks with the stuff coming out that they don't want. There are a lot of people talking about stuff. Shameful, isn't it? And one story in particular, not quite sure where it came from, but it said that the president, obviously the first lady, is in New York with Barron, and he said today in his news conference they'll come down in June after the end of the school year. So he is by himself in the mansion now. He's usually just with his old friend and security guard, guy named Keith Schiller, who came down from New York with him, and he just kind of keeps him company at night. And the story is that the president walks around in a bathrobe and watches a lot of TV. It's like it's fine, that's what people do. But when that got out, they had a fit because that's not the kind of image that they wanted to portray. And Sean Spicer the next day went out of his way to say, well, I don't even think the president has a bathrobe, at which point pictures of him in a bathrobe were all over Twitter. Of course he owns a bathrobe. And I don't think it's a big deal. It just shows how sensitive they are about that. And there are pictures of every president in bathrobes or pajamas, including President Ford. A couple of pictures meeting with aides. Who cares? They're just in their pajamas and such. But in terms of the larger privacy question, I think Trump actually, the president seems to, he's kind of a creature of habit. He doesn't go out much. He's an indoors person, I think. He likes being inside the White House. He hasn't gone out to local restaurants or anything. He, I think, is quite happy where he is. Other presidents have kind of chafed at being cooped up. They didn't necessarily like it. Bill Clinton, who was very much a people person, used to call it, the crown jewel in the American prison system. He used to say that he could look out the window of the White House and see people walking down the street. He said, "I wish I could go out there and just get a cup of coffee or something and meet girls or something." But no, I made that last part up. But it might be true. Like, what's your name? And then, and Harry Truman called it the Great White Jail. And Bess Truman, some first ladies have actually really despised living in the White House. Bess Truman hated living in the White House. Michelle Obama was not a great fan of living in the White House either. She thought it was too intrusive. And if you notice last year when President Obama would go on the campaign trail, people kept saying 4 more years, and his response was always, well, I can't do that. She won't let me. I think she was not, some first ladies liked it more than others. I think Bess Truman in particular, she really hated the White House. Mrs. Obama, I think, to a lesser extent. But by and large, there's all the privacy you want, I think, on that second floor. But I did show you that the window of, the kitchen, can still be seen if you're walking around and you're in your bathrobe. So, there's no such thing as, total privacy, but the Secret Service and aides to the president and such, they do their best to, and they deserve privacy, and they certainly do. It's a very tough job, and I wish, joking about President Trump before, those are jokes. You've got to wish him well. He's in a tough job, and his success is all of ours as well. I think a lot of people in this room who disagree with him, didn't vote for him, but I think that's sort of the general. It's like we're all on the same ship here, so that's sort of my view. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I told you we'd have a good time tonight. Thank you for living up to with some great questions. We have a pen set to help you sign copies of your book.
Oh.
And it just happens to have the signature of our favorite president, Gerald R. Ford.
Oh, my goodness.
So may you
Thank
sign
you
in
very
good health.
much.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you so much.